Welcome, everybody. I am delighted to welcome you to the NLI USA Signature Speaker Series. I'm Adina Canefield, the CEO of NLI USA. As many of you know, the speaker series is designed to highlight the library's treasures at its work and to bring it to you in meaningful and relevant and timely ways. With that, in honor of Women's History Month and the upcoming celebration of Purim, we bring you Genie Milgrom, who will share her journey in discovering the heroines in her ancestry. Genie is an award-winning author of 4 books, including How I Found My 15 Grandmothers. She is dedicated to supporting communities of crypto Jews, and she regularly travels around the world to share her story, to advocate for wider access to community records, and to provide Jewish educational resources. Her research has been showcased widely in numerous publications, including the Jerusalem Post and the Miami Herald. Genie is joined today by Yochai Ben-Ghedalia, who will shed light on the library's work uncovering and digitizing Inquisition and pre-Inquisition archives with the generous help of partners like Genie. Dr. Yochai Ben-Ghedalia serves as the director of the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People, a subsidiary of the National Library of Israel. He received his doctorate in Jewish history from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His forthcoming book, European Jewish Philanthropy and Jerusalem During the Crimean War, will be published this year in Hebrew at the Ben-Zvi Institute. As you enjoy this talk, I invite you to pose questions in the chat function, and those questions will be addressed towards the end of our program. With that, I give you Yochai.
Thanks, Adina, for the introduction. One of the great privileges of working in an archive is that you can encounter on a daily basis great people from the past. Usually you meet them through correspondence, protocols, photographs, and it's really inspiring. Some of them are really VIPs, important people. Some of them are more ordinary people, but not less inspiring. But still, as part of our work, we also have the privilege to work with and to meet really special people. And one of the most special people I ever met as part of my work is Genie. And I'm very, very happy that you will also be able to meet her today. Genie is really, the meeting with Genie was really special, not only due to her personal story. We will hear about it a bit today, but you will be able also to see it through documentary films, but mostly due to her personality, her knowledge, her passion about Jewish history, and her commitment to make this knowledge part of a wider community. So thank you, Jenny, for being with us tonight or today for you. At the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People, we have thousands of Jewish communities from throughout the world. We have communities from the late medieval period till today, and from 5 continents. And there's lots of knowledge in those collections. But when we try to find documentation about pre-expulsion Spain or Portugal, we encounter a problem because there are almost no community archive that survived. We know that there were archives at the time. For example, in a visit to Girona about a month ago, I saw remainings of a community pincas, a community ledger, that was preserved inside the binding. It was used as a secondary use for binding and survived. But usually we do not find community archives. So in order to find documentation about Jews, we need to go to various archives, various general archives, and look for documentation that was accumulated by the various state agencies and other systems that had interface with the Jews. And those archives includes fantastic documentation. We will find that in the archives of the Crown, in the archives of the nobility, in the church archives, could be either the main cathedrals or the parish or the monasteries, or like we will hear later on today in the special courts like the Inquisition, but could also be the municipal archives that also had a lot to do with the Jews. So in addition to what we will have, right? So in addition of some materials that we may have as originals by us from that period, like those sermons that maybe Jenny will talk about them later on, there's lots of materials that could be found in general archives there. For example, inside the Cathedral of Barcelona, the well-known Cathedral of Barcelona, you will go from a door outside, not the main entrance that all the tourists go through. You will find fantastic archives that has documentation about Jews going back to the 9th century in such a richness and such a intact archives that can include so much documentation. That's really fantastic. Maybe I'll just share one document I saw recently, and this is an inventory of house belongings from Jewish community in Beipuig, which is in Catalonia. It's a small community, and as part of following the expulsion, there was a need to make a liquidation of the community belongings. So that's a small ledger, including all the houses of the Jews who lived where. And this page, for example, is an inventory of the belongings of the synagogue of the community. So that's a really touching, snapshot of a very special moment, very sad moment of the expulsion. So we, as part of our work, we try to map those documents, to summarize them, and to digitize some of them. And together with the help of Jenny, that we will talk more about that later on, we try to make it public. We serve, as part of our work, both at the library and at the archives, we are trying to serve a wide range of audience. We work with, there are researchers, academic researchers coming to us, and we are very happy about that. But we also are very happy to serve a wide community of genealogists, like Jenny. Some of them come on a very personal basis, others are coming more on a more wider scope, like Jenny, trying as part of a community of family historians. And we had fantastic cooperations in the past, for example, with a special interest group of Jewish Jane in Ukraine. We digitized endless amount of materials which are now accessible only by us because nobody can access the archives in Ukraine. But as part of the cooperation with Jenny, we were able to make lots of the work that we have been doing in the past in Spain and Portugal to make them accessible online, and we're very thankful for that. And we soon will reestablish that work in archives in Spain as in joint forces with our colleagues at the Hebrew Manuscript Department at the library, and Gesher Europa, which is a program at the library aimed at cooperation with Europe. So before I move to Jenny, I just want to come back to this document, the liquidation of the Jewish community in 1492. In first thought, I thought that that's the last moment. That's a snapshot of the last moment. But Jenny, that was not really the last moment, right? I mean, there were Jewish life after that. right? So I'll be very happy if you could talk more about sources that you find in archives and your story that you can find from that.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Yochai. And thank you also, Adina, all the staff, the National Library, and Yochai. It's amazing to have reached this day. I remember the first time I went to see you, and with this boundless energy of wanting to find things, and you were probably thinking, who is this woman and why is she here? But now it's many, many years later. Our collaboration has been going on for many years, and it really is very exciting to have been able to get to the point where we have digitized these thousands and thousands of documents. So I thank you for putting up with my boundless energy and for working so closely with me and your staff, Anastasia, and other people in your organization to get to where we are today. So you said something like, you showed a picture of an auto da fe from Lisbon. I remember looking at it carefully when I was last in Israel. And I think, I don't know if we can put that up for a minute. So this sermon here, it actually was a little bit, I'd say scary, creepy, it might be a better word, because this is the actual, I was holding in my hand the book with the actual sermon that they were giving, the church was giving as they were parading all of the people that were going to be going to be burned at the stake. So this was particularly chilling. And of course, to find that you had this, I believe you had two of them. And inside it also has the names of some of the victims, something that I never knew that this existed. So it was really amazing. But I don't know if you have a copy of what we actually digitized by the thousands. Yochai there, perhaps the 1 page or 2 pages from the Spanish and Portuguese surveys. Did you put that up?
Can you see it now?
No, I still see the auto da fe. So I'll just talk a little bit about it while he gets that up. So what I asked Yochai to give me anything that had to do with Latin America or the Inquisition or Spain, Portugal, and he gave me this very long index card holder. And that's perfect. And in the index card holder, I asked to see every single file. I'm sure they weren't happy, but I arrived very early and I stayed very late, and I was floored by what was there. And I was floored by the fact that it was still inside folders, and I knew that they had to see the light. So here is a document from the Cathedral of Avila, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of documents like this that have already been digitized. They are up and they are ready to be seen. And this particular one starts in 1465, and it talks about, I found, and again, there's thousands, so I had to pick a few. I found it fascinating that within this one document, you have genealogy, you have who was a butcher and who was a tailor and who was doing laundry and where they were doing it. Some of the other documents, I don't know if you have up the map that I sent you from one of the documents. So some of the documents were maps, and some of the documents like this one. So this is from a street in Andujar. So it says which was the street of the Juderia, and where was the synagogue, and where was the mikvah. And some of the documents will actually say things like, things that don't exist anymore today. It'll say things like, if you exit the Church of the Holy Rosary through the back door and you take 10 steps to the left and you go up 5 steps and you go 7 steps to the right, this is where the synagogue was. So the reality is that all of this that has now been digitized, I think I went as far as 1100, 1200, this is way before the Inquisition. This had nothing, I mean, this was not about my past and all of this. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is more that I could not fathom that all of this history, things that could be put into thesis, things for historians, to just bring it out to light and have people be able to access. All of this is up. Recently, they sent me another stack of thousands of documents, and I organize it and I try to index it. But this is the type of document that I worked closely with the library to index. So my own family history, I discovered by, my family was Roman Catholic for 523 years. I returned to the Jewish people about 30 years ago. I returned on my own, feeling Jewish without knowing that I had this kind of background, let's say. So the search came after the fact, and I think that's it helped me a lot that I was already able to understand the research that had to be done. But basically, for me to be able to piece my history back, and initially I found 15 grandmothers maternally in a row, and then eventually I went back to 22. So I had to find documentation on 22 women, going back from my mom back to them being burned alive in many of the Inquisitions. At the end of the day, I researched so much that I found that my family really, from my mom's side and my dad's side, 28 lineages from me go back to the forced Jews from before the Inquisition. So the kind of documents that I had to work with, and Yochai was correct, there are many things that are missing if you're looking as a Jew, right? If you're looking as a Jew, there's no Jewish cemeteries, there are no Brit Milah, there's no, there's no weddings, there's no ketubas, there's none of this. All of this was destroyed. However, I had a different search. I was going back via the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church, they didn't destroy anything. It's all nice and dandy and neatly in little packages for you. So yes, it's very onerous. It's very difficult. It's not simple, but going back via the Catholic Church, this absolutely I found for these grandmothers every single birth, death, marriage certificate. And I went all the way back to 1545. And when the church stopped, when church records ended, or they only began in 1545 in an organized fashion, then I went back and I had to read land sale deeds, notarial deeds. I had to read a lot of last wills and testaments to be able to piece together the family. And I think that this is the importance of these documents that have been digitized now from Spain and Portugal, because none of this is going to be in one place neatly ready for you to see. Meaning my mission for, I think since about 8 or 9 years now, has been to get this stuff up on the internet, because somebody like me who wants to return to the Jewish people, and again, I converted before I knew that any of this existed, and not knowing that I was Jewish all along, but you have to go to many different places to put it all together. This is not like, people moved around a lot. You have to find these things, you have to put them together. And something I discovered along the way as well is that there's a lot written on the Peruvian Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition in Peru, in Cartagena, Colombia, in Mexico City, everywhere there was an Inquisition. As a matter of fact, a week and a half ago, I was in Goa, India, looking at the documents that are in Goa and Kochi, where the Portuguese burned Jews alive in Goa at the Portuguese Inquisition in Goa, India. So there was a very far-reaching, so obviously, because I'm looking at everything at the same time, let's say from a bird's eye view, I am able to see the communication between the Inquisition offices. I'm able to see the formats that are used in one country and are used in another country. I've read through thousands and thousands of these documents. I have found about 45, 50 people burned at the stake from my maternal line, and I have read all of their Inquisition records. I have read their genealogies. I was able to complete my genealogy, a lot of it based on the Inquisition records. Pretty much that's all we have. We don't have any of the other stuff. So I had to piece everything together. So
Jenny, can you tell us a bit more about how exactly an Inquisition record can serve you as a genealogist? I mean,
sure.
I can understand how birth records will serve you and death records, but how are Inquisition files? That's something that has to do with faith.
So the Inquisition files are called procesos, like process. Basically, it's a court document. The Inquisition was a court, the Inquisition court. So the minute that they suspected you of being Jewish, you would be brought in, meaning not being Jewish. I take that back. They were not bringing you in for being Jewish, because then, let's say, even back then, politically correct, they would bring you in for Judaizing. It's completely different. Spain considers that as of 1492, there were no Jews. Period. There were no Jews. I have been told to my face a year ago in an archive that there were no Jews in Spain, well knowing that there were crypto Jews hiding. So they were brought in for Judaizing, which meant for practicing the Jewish faith or for hiding the Jewish faith. And we'll go back to Saint Esther in a minute because we're in Purim time, but they were brought in for this. So the minute that they brought you in, they put you in front of the Grand Inquisitor, and this judgment called a proceso began to be written out by hand. Most of them are written on pergamino. I've physically held my family's judgments in Portugal at the archives. And then they would start, where do you live? What do you do? Etc. And who is your family? And they would keep you there for hours until you started saying, well, I have a great aunt Matilda and she lives in so-and place. And they would force you to give your full genealogy. And that was early on in this judgment, like on page 9, let's say, whereas this judgment is written in pergamino, longhand, medieval Portuguese, Spanish, and they are anywhere between 150 pages to 500-600 pages. I've even seen them standing almost as tall as I do. So you would give your full genealogy, and that's where the genealogies are. But that wasn't enough. Then they'd throw you in a dungeon along with everyone else. They would paint the dungeons black, so you wouldn't even know day, night. They would keep you in there. And then somewhere like on day 45, they'd bring you back in to corroborate the genealogy again, because they were looking for your family. And this is why we have to access these procesos, because that's where our genealogy is. Now, is there an element that could be lying, could be not lying? I'm sure there could be, but when you get to the point where you've been in a dungeon for 45 days and you haven't seen the light of day, and you're just thrown in there and you don't know if you're going to live or die, I would think that after a while you'd stop lying if you were lying. So that is how we are able to go, and it's pretty quickly in the process so that you find your family. So the tie-in, before I go on with the documents, so one of the things that obviously the Inquisition knew, when was Yom Kippur, when were the fasts, when was Rosh Hashanah? I mean, they absolutely knew when all of this was happening. So they couldn't take a chance to be seen by their neighbors, who would throw them to the Inquisition, because the Inquisition was offering free education, was offering all sorts of incentives for the neighbors and the servants to throw you to the wolves. So basically, they started fasting and this is Portugal. I'm not sure if this was done in Spain. My family lived in Portugal most of the time after they were caught. So they would start fasting for Purim on the fast of Esther. And because they didn't want to appear that they were doing anything Jewish, they would pack up a huge picnic basket. They would put everything in it. They would go by the river, the whole family, as if they were going on a picnic. And then they were telling their neighbors that they were celebrating the feast of Saint Esther. To this day, there was a minor saint Catholic that was Esther, but to this day, the fast of Saint Esther and Purim are synonymous with the fast for Yom Kippur. Some people in Belmonte in Portugal, that I have been there for weeks and weeks studying these families that were still Jewish after 500 years, they are still fasting on the feast of Saint Esther when there really isn't any such thing.
It's really fascinating because Esther in the Bible, I mean, at least in Hebrew, Esther means concealment, I mean, hiding. And
I didn't know that. So.
And her figure is someone who came into power, and nobody knew exactly what's her, from which religion is she, from which people she comes to.
That's interesting that was the one that was picked to be the saint. So the Feast of Saint Esther is coming up. And I saw real quickly, because we'll be answering questions later, but somebody said, how did they hide the Torah Scrolls, etc. So in Portugal, in many of the villages, it became a matriarchal society, and every family, and again, I'm going by what I have been told personally in Braganza, where my own family lived, and in, again, 200, 300 years ago, and in Belmonte. So each family would memorize one of the books of the Torah, and they would know it, they would memorize it completely, and there were no prayer books, there were no, that was gone, the Torah Scrolls were gone, and people would memorize it and teach it to their kids when they reached bar mitzvah age. So it was matriarchal. The women were the ones memorizing a lot of this. And when on one of my visits to Belmonte, I visited a woman named Penina, and she wouldn't talk to anybody because they keep to themselves, but she took me upstairs to her apartment, and it was Motzei Shabbos. It was very dark in the village, and she taught me a prayer, a blessing, a bracha that no one's ever heard of before, which was a blessing to tie the linen together 7 times like a braid, to be able to light the candles of Shabbat. I'm sorry, not the candles, the oil lamp. And she taught me the blessing for lighting the oil lamp, and she taught me the blessing when I wanted to write it down 4 years ago. She went ballistic. I had to memorize it, and she didn't want me to write anything down. I came home with a linen, I came home with a little tin candle, but her daughter, who was 16 years old, went in the other side of the house, and she wrote the blessing down for me. So this kind of thing is still happening until today. So there's all of these traditions are in the records. Recipes. It's amazing how we glean this information. When my mom died 2 years ago, she had been hiding from me all of these recipes from the Inquisition, and I had them. One of them was Haman's ears. There was for Purim, there was a pork chop made out of French toast that people would eat and throw a real pork chop in the oven. So unbelievable, not in the oven, in the fire, but it's unbelievable that we have to piece this together. So the importance of the digitization all over the place is to finally get the story, look at it from above, and piece together what is on paper, what needs to be digitized, and what is in things that are in the home, such as the recipes that my mom had. So it's really, this whole thing is pieced together like a big puzzle, like a mosaic. And to me, I happen to be a mosaic artist as a hobby. And I've always felt that somehow, like, my life started out Catholic, in Cuba. I was born in Cuba. My life started out completely Catholic. And then all of a sudden, I'm probably the proudest Jew you know, and researching all of this Jewish history. It's almost like a jug was thrown down. It became a million pieces. And to get to the truth of the story, you have to find those pieces scattered around the world, put them back together. And just like you put together a mosaic, you can put back and piece together again a life of a descendant of a crypto-Jewish family. Yochai, I can't hear you. Okay.
Thanks. So can you tell us something very touching that you've met in one of those processes about one of your ancestors? Something more specifically touching.
So they were killing anybody. They were killing children. They were burning. I mean, the mode of killing was burning, right? So they were burning alive in these auto da fes. That's why that book I found by you was particularly creepy, because I just felt that, you know, maybe there was a priest that had been reading that book at one of the funeral pyres of my own family. So it was particularly creepy for me to hold that in my hand. But I was particularly touched, not so much by the children. The children just went along for it. The fact that 85-year-olds, and, you know, usually they didn't live that long, but they did. They were burned alive, you know, the men, the women. But there was one 15-year-old girl, and I read her proceso, and her name was Macias, Macias. I've never heard the name before. So Macias refused to give up her belief in the law of Moses. They didn't call it Judaism. They called it the Mosaic law, and in Spanish, la ley de Moisés. So the Inquisition offered you the opportunity, once you got out to this auto da fe. The auto da fe started early in the morning, like a fair. People would come, like imagine a Renaissance fair. They would come and they would have ribbons and banners, and they'd be baking, and there would be food, and it was a very carnival-like scene. And then they would parade the Jews wearing these special garments. The garment said on the back, it's called a San Benito. The garment would say what you had done. So not following the law of Moses. And they offered you, right before they put you on the funeral pyre, I mean, the fire, they offered, if you would accept Jesus, they would do you the favor of chopping off your head before they burned you. So that you wouldn't feel the fire. And none of my family, I'm happy to report, none of my family, I mean, I probably would have, but I mean, who knows? You don't know how you would react. But none of them accepted it. But this girl, Macias, they recorded every single word that she said, and she was so adamant about the law, about the laws, and about Moses, and about dying as a Jew. And, you know, she said, I'm going to die as a Jew. And I think they burned her twice. So I'd say, Yochai, that the story of this 15-year-old girl, more than anything, and her bravery. And I mean, how could I not look for the history? In other words, how is it an option for me? A lot of my friends tell me you have this passion, or I would say more than the passion, I'm obsessed, because I just feel that the world has got to see these examples of those that came before us, what they struggled for to be a Jew, how they stepped up to a funeral pyre to be a Jew. So yes, and there were many, many touching. And as far as being, let's say, totally overwhelmed, the first time that I went to the archive in Portugal, to Torre do Tombo, and they had pulled out all the Inquisition records of my family. And again, they were like 200 pages thick. and I was able to look at it, and I turned to the last page where the Inquisitor had signed their death sentences, and to turn to that last page, and I was visibly nauseous. I mean, I still have, the pictures of that day, and I'm white. I mean, it was visceral for me to look at the Inquisitors and know that my family came from this. But that also, I think, was one of the most emotional moments, to be able to actually see the Inquisitor who signed off on the deaths of my own family members.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for sharing that, because for us, there are hundreds of people coming to our reading room, working on the documents. Some of them are historians, academic historians, some are genealogists, and sometimes we can see the products of their work as books or articles, as websites. Usually, I don't have the privilege of asking them what they found, exactly how they found, but mostly not what they feel about what they found. And it's really unique for me to have this opportunity to talk to you. So thanks. It's not that you are only working on trying to find your own family history. You're trying to make it more, to make those findings available to a much wider community. So I have two questions about that. First of all, I want to hear more about your work on the community engagement, and also to ask what is exactly the boundaries of this community, whether it's Jewish community, or former families of crypto Jews, or maybe the story is not only the story of saying about us, my parents, my ancestors. It's not only a story from the Jewish or from the conversos perspective, but maybe also it's a Iberian story or Latin American story, because that's part of culture. Jews were part of that. The conversos were part of that. So
Correct.
what's the boundaries of the community?
So right now, my greater reach and what I've been doing, and before we move on, just one last thing. This is the village of my ancestors, which is called Fermoselle. It's on the border right between Spain and Portugal, overlooking the natural boundary of the Duero River, or the Douro River, depending if you were. So they lived with 1 foot in Spain and 1 foot in Portugal. But right on top of that staircase, in that little hole that you see up there, that was the home of my 15th grandmother. And it was her genealogy that I found in Portugal, in a proceso, that brought me to my last, for sure, that I was Jewish. I gathered, and just to finish with my story, I gathered up all of my documents. I had done it twice. I went to Israel. I went to the Beit Din in Jerusalem, and they transcribed all of my documents into Hebrew. It took a couple of years, and I got a beautiful letter from the Beit Din, and I had been looking for this none of my family returned. They all know, they call themselves ancestral Jews, whatever that means, but they're all Catholic. So Catholic practicing, let's put it that way. So in families, usually only one person returns, which is very common, and not every, around the world, only one person returns. So this Beit Din wrote me that I had reached this in a very roundabout way. However, that the ruling was that I was born Jewish, and that my ascendants and descendants were Jewish. So the rabbi gave it to me, and he said, pretty much verbatim, I'm giving you this document, and you need to solve the problem in your crazy family and bring everybody back to the Jewish people. And I knew I couldn't. It took me about 15 years to find this. I knew the attitudes of my family. Nobody's a religious Catholic, by the way. They're just Catholic by name, but no one was going to come and do everything that I do. So I decided that if I couldn't do it for my own family, what I was going to do was that I was going to do it for other people in other families and help people returning. So I became very vocal on an international scale. I've spoken at the Knesset, at the EU press box. I've spoken all over the place. And I have a YouTube channel, and I talk and I talk and I keep talking. God bless me with a big mouth. So I'm able to continue to tell my story. And I tell my story not because I want to tell my story. I tell my story to make it easy for somebody following behind me to tell their story and to return. So I travel to the emerging communities of Latin America. I go into El Salvador. I go into Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. I go into these communities and I teach. During the pandemic, I had 400 students that I was teaching in Spanish, which is not really something I'm super comfortable in. I speak Spanish, obviously, but I'm not as perfectly eloquent. I even became a commercial mashgiach online so that I could teach them how to properly kosher their commercial kitchens. So my husband and I have been blessed to be able to build 2 or 3 mikvot. I'm heading back down there. We supply them with Sidurim and we get donations of Torahs, and we're just very active. My husband teaches classes on Sunday to the emerging communities in Cote d'Ivoire, Mozambique. And so both of us have become very active in helping the emerging communities to come forward. And obviously, I help them research whenever they want. And that's where we are.
I think it's a good opportunity also to thank Michael. Your husband,
Michael is
I
wonderful.
I know, I mean, coming with you to the archives and trying to find what to do once you were so dwelled into the document.
Michael is wonderful. He's a saint from a different time. Michael's Ashkenazi. He's from Romania, a rabbinical Hasidic family, gets mixed up with me. And, you know, like his mom would have said, oy vavoy, because, you know, what a thing. But Michael is my support. He's with me all the time. If I ask him to teach, he teaches. And I could never have done any of this without him, because he schleps everywhere with me. And he has helped me to be able to do this more than anybody else.
Yeah, and before we move to the questions, they see there's endless questions there. Just want to to understand more. I know that the Inquisition kept working for a long period. Did you find materials about crypto-Jews from much, I mean, how late were documents?
Okay, so the Inquisition did not fully dissolve, let's use the word, until 1834 in some places, 1850, 1860. I stopped in the year 1690. I stopped seeing my family being apprehended. So that tells me that in 1690 or so, they just decided that basta, that's it. I'm going to be a good Catholic, but the traditions were still there. My grandmother taught me how to put dough in the oven. She didn't teach me the bracha. She taught me to check for blood in the eggs. She taught me to check the vegetables for insects, saying it was Spanish customs. So this stayed in their DNA, or stayed in their soul, or just passed down verbally. She left me some jewelry as well. So for me, it was 1690. I think the Mexican and the Peruvian Inquisition lasted a little bit longer, but for me, it was 1690.
I think it's a good, since there are so many questions I see in the chat, so maybe I think it's a good time to go back to Adina, then she will take care of the questions. Adina?
Did Adina leave? There you are.
Hi, I'm sorry, my screen was frozen. Are you ready to move to questions?
Sure.
Excellent. Genie, this is just absolutely mind transforming, and everyone is just astonished by the work that you're doing. So many questions. There were a bunch that really relate to you and a little bit more about your family. First of all, how did the portion of your family that did survive, how did they survive? What do you know about that line that, that survived? And did they go, to Amsterdam? Did they go other places? What do you know about the survival line?
So the family moved on from Spain to Portugal, back to Spain. And again, we all have 32 lines that come up from us, from our great-grandparents. I was able to research 28. As they moved from Spain to the Canary Islands, they were caught in the Inquisition of the Canary Islands before they went on to Cuba. Another portion of the family went to Cadiz, Spain. From Portugal, they were caught in the Inquisitions of Cadiz. Then they got on ships, went to Cartagena, Colombia, got caught in the Inquisitions of Cartagena, Colombia, and went on to Costa Rica. So I think some went to Jamaica and then went to Spain. Some were in Cordoba and then went to Cuba. So following my family's trajectory in the early days and up to the late 1690s, they were killed in the Inquisitions of about 8 or 9 different cities. So I think maybe you mentioned I wrote my first book, My 15 Grandmothers, when I got to my 15th, and I told my personal story. But as I got into the archival material, I took the archival material and I wrote a second book called Pyre to Fire. And that was from the funeral pyre to the fire in the soul. And in there, I was able to follow the trajectory of the family as they went back and forth from one place to the other. And I had to write it as fiction, but actually the book is about 85% correct. So I was able to follow their trajectory via the archival material.
Okay, you touched on this, and this is a little personal, but if you could share, to the extent that you feel comfortable, your family's reaction to your work, and then also relatedly, you mentioned that you received your grandmother's recipes, wondering why you didn't get those earlier. Why do you think your mother didn't share those? And if you could just open that.
Sure. And I'm always very open again, and I said it before. If I'm a leader of this, whatever we want to call it, movement, people. If I am not honest, then how can I expect other people to feel comfortable to be honest? So my mom was appalled. I mean, appalled. My mom, my family came from a very interesting, place in society, of the Cuban society. That same society moved to Miami. They had their own, parties, this and that. And I was in Catholic schools. I was from kindergarten through university. I went to mass every Sunday, and my family never came with me, ever. My sister and I, she's 4 years older, we would be in the church by ourselves. All of these people were hugging and kissing and blah, 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 big Cuban families. My sister and I were like in a corner waiting for my parents to pick us up. It was, I didn't understand it until, one of those jokes nowadays, how old were you when you learned this? So when I started to look into Judaism and return, and I had no idea that I had this background. It was just drawing me and drawing me and drawing me from the time I was a child. My mom just couldn't handle it. She stopped talking to me. My family stopped talking to me. I lost all my girlfriends from, before. I was alone. It took me 5.5 years or so, 5 years maybe, to convert, the whole process from beginning to end. And I was very alone. My ex-husband obviously became an ex-husband because, this was very hard. And I was alone with my 2 kids. And then I came, I converted traditionally Orthodox, and And that was even more alone, right? So it took a few years. I met Michael several years later, and we made our family within the community. And I'm in Miami. I belong to Young Israel, and I have for many, many years since back in the day. And my friends were my family. My friends were who were at our Passover tables. So it was extremely hard. And people that are returning, it's hard. You have to have a certain tenacity to get there. So as the years passed, and then I continued to dive into it, and then my mom learned that she was Jewish also. That didn't go over well, but it went over better as the years passed. So she never gave me the recipes. I only was able to get them from her house after she got Alzheimer's, and we'll go into that. So one day she tells me she wants to see my rabbi, and I'm like, please, because come on, this hadn't been easy. So my husband, who is really amazing, he took my mom to see my rabbi, and I already had the letter from Israel. Obviously, we knew that she was Jewish ancestry, but it was felt that she had to do one mitzvah. So she told my rabbi that she did not want to die Catholic. And he had her light candles with me, one mitzvah on a Friday night. And a couple of days later, my mom went into Alzheimer's. I never was able to talk to her. I was never able to ask why. It was the last conscious thing she did. And she went into memory care. She died last year. And in all those years from 2014, I was never able to ask her. But for all intents and purposes, my mom died as a Jew, even though she was not a practicing Jew, but she did do that one candle lighting. My children grew up in my home. They were already older as I went through this. So, when you're in let's say a secular kind of environment, they were not brought up religious at all. And, Shabbat and Kashrut and all of these things that we follow doesn't go over well with a 10-year-old, right? So it was very difficult for them. Today, my children admire and they are on board with everything that I'm doing, but they are not religious in this and they are not religious in that. They are not religious at all.
So there have been, everyone is astonished by the amount of work that you're doing. And there have been some questions around who else is doing this? Who is doing this with you? How are you, who are your partners here besides Yochai? And have other people like you been documenting, their memoirs based on this kind of research? So if you can fill us in on sort of the community.
So I'm kind of a lone wolf, and not because I want to be, but because I look behind me and I worry that there is no one behind me. And I worry about that all the time. I really do. I'm attached to several organizations. I'll use the word attached because a few years ago, I got off every board. I knew I was president of this and president of that, and I just didn't have time to go to all those board meetings and actually do my work. So the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies, I lecture, I help people. They're out of Colorado. I was president for 8 years. The Genealogical Jewish Society of Miami, I was president for 8 years. Right now, I work the emerging communities with the organization kulanu.org. I'm associated to the American Sephardi Federation Institute of Jewish Learning. We just came up with a certificate of Sephardic ancestry to help people feel like they belong. So, but actually working with me in tandem and there is no one. I will partner with someone like Yochai. I'll partner with people like MyHeritage in Israel who do digitization, but there is no, let's say, central organization, but I do see the people returning, and I see them returning in droves. And normally they come to me and I advise them and I help them. And I by the way, I do not charge ever a penny for anything that I do. That is not to encourage another 700 emails a month, but I do not do this for money. I feel that I was so blessed to find my own ancestry. I have to help other people, or I point them in the right direction. When people ask me questions, I advise them and I point them in the right direction. I don't do the work for anybody. Up on my website and the American Sephardi Federation, I uploaded personally, my own little hands, 60,000 entries of the Mexican Inquisition, the Lima Inquisition, the Colombian Inquisition, so that people could look up to see if their relatives had been in these inquisitions. So I wish, Adina, that I had a whole crew, but I don't. And I've pretty much done this alone. And now I'm trying to encourage. I've brought on a couple of younger people that I'm encouraging to try to take over in the future.
Dina, if I can add, thanks to Genie, lots of the documentation that we have been gathering for many years are now available online. And so there are many other people that can actually now access them only also through the NLI website and use them and work with them either today, either in a few years' time, so they're there. So that's thanks to the cooperation with Gene.
Thank you, Yochai. I'm really excited to tell you all that. I'm in the middle of filming a documentary that we're hoping will make the film festivals about my journey. And in 2 weeks, I'm leaving to follow the footsteps of the family in this documentary. So I'm really excited about that because I think that it will further the narrative of the descendants of the crypto Jews.
There were some questions around the languages that you speak, and also that you, the languages that are in the documents that you're reading. And so if you could share a little bit about that, both the Jewish and the Inquisition documents.
Sure. So I speak and write and read Spanish fluently, English, Portuguese. I'm able to read the medieval Portuguese, is very similar to Spanish. Not that it helps in this realm, but I do speak Yiddish. And I grew up with my grandparents speaking a little known language called Mirandés. Initially, I thought it was like a mixture of Ladino, but it's not. And so I also understand Mirandés. These documents are written in Spanish, or as it's known, not really Spanish, but Castilian. It's different, and medieval. So you have to be able to read it, and you get the hang of it after a while. And the Portuguese documents are written in medieval Portuguese, and in Mexico in Spanish, Lima in Spanish. So it's all medieval, but it's basically Spanish or Portuguese.
Can you comment on the accessibility of the documents, how they're governed? Are they governed by local cities owning these documents and the gateway to accessibility? Is it the government, the state? How is that organized? And can you give credit to some local cities or countries that have been particularly helpful in making documents accessible, and those that you can hold up as really exemplary?
So Portugal has been exemplary. In Portugal, they were owned by the government, all the Inquisition documents, and they have been completely open doors. Portugal has been amazing. In general, they're owned as patrimony. They're owned by the government. In a couple of cities in Spain, they're still owned by the church. And that gets harder when you try to digitize. The church ownership will know what is the intent. The intent is for people to find their genealogy, to leave the church and go back to be Jewish. That's not going over so big. So generally, I come at it with this is Jewish patrimony, because, I don't care. It was the Vatican. It was this. This is, this is our history in there. I have in Canary Islands, I've gone twice to Palma, and there's a treasure trove. The Canary Islands is a treasure trove. But the Inquisition, all the records are owned by 400 families. And they are quite elderly. At some point, somebody stole all the information and took it to London, and these 400 families bought it back. So I tried to meet with them. I had gotten really far, and then the archivist died. So I'm going to have to go back to the Canary Islands. And the most difficult, if there's anybody on this, of the couple hundred people that are there, if there is anybody that really has high ranking connections in Spain, and I mean high, because I've been at it since 2015, I cannot break through. I'm still struggling. It is not a simple matter to resolve. And it's now in the hands of the Minister of Culture. And anything higher than the Minister of Culture is what I would need. And that is ground zero. So that's where I'm really struggling. Everything else falls into place.
All right. Well, if there's anyone out there that can help Genie on her quest, her noble quest, please be in touch with us. There have been a couple people who have wanted to get a recording. We will be sharing that. We'll email it to everyone that's registered. And for those of you whose questions were not answered, you'll be able to, reach Genie and probably answer some of your questions by looking at her website. And I'm sure she will, be happy to get an email from you and continue a relationship.
Sure, go into geniemilgrom.com. You can reach me through there. A lot of the things are answered on my website, and feel free to email me from there, and I will try to guide you.
With that, I want to thank you all for joining. I want to thank Genie and Yochai for your work in the community, for sharing it with us, and for opening our eyes to something that's just so important and an interesting part of our history that we all need to really understand and learn more about. And that's really the essence of what the National Library of Israel is all about. It's preserving this incredible history of our people and helping it enrich lives as it did for Genie. All these documents really shaped your identity, and that's one of the many reasons why the library exists. So thank you all. Thank you for being friends of the library. Stay tuned to nliusa.org for more information about events, and at nli.org.il for even more. And with that, we thank you for being a part of our community.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.